Welcome to the Social Mission Revolution. Each week we explore some of the greatest undertold stories of businesses and everyday people who are making their ultimate impact on the world through social mission. This is Social Mission Revolution, and this is your host, Andrea Putting. Welcome to the Social Mission Revolution. And today I'm here with my guest, Vera Entwistle. And I have wanted to have Vera on my podcast since I started it. So I'm very excited to actually make this happen today. So welcome, Vera.
Thank you.
So Vera is the founder of Camp Quality, and which started back in the 1980s, wasn't it?
83 was the first year.
Yeah, I thought it was around then. So I've known Vera for a bit longer than that, and I'm sure today we're going to get a lot of insight. So welcome, Vera. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast at last. And I'd like to start with my question that I ask everybody. If there was just one thing for you to fight for, what would that be?
In many ways, that's not an easy question to answer because of the word fight. One of the things that I found in the early years of Camp Quality was I was surrounded by negativity, people convinced it would never work. And it got very discouraging at times. And in the first year, I shudder now when I think of how close I came so many times to throwing in the towel, because I used to long for somebody to say to me, "What a good idea, how can I help?" But that's not what they said. They said, "How depressing to be asked to volunteer to work one-on-one with a child with cancer, how depressing." And anyway, parents with a very sick child are not going to let them go off with a bunch of strangers for a week, so you can forget getting the parents to let the kids come. And the money you'll never get, because charities in 73, they said, we're having a hard time. And it was always the negative attitude of the people that really I got depressed about their attitude for a while. And it was interesting. I remember coming home one day, and I'd had that all day. Everywhere I went, I was faced with it. And I sat down, and Brian said, "Okay, where have you been today?" And I said, "I've been in Never Never Land all day. Everybody is so convinced this won't work." And I started sharing some of the stuff with him, and he let me rant on for a while. And then he said, "Okay, now, at the end of that, what does your gut tell you?" And I said, "My gut says, don't listen to them. It will go, and it will be a success. Just put the blinders on and go for it." So he said, "Well, that's what you need to do." And it was a case every day, Andrew, for the first couple of years of putting on those blinders, because so many people who really didn't know what they were talking about, these weren't people that had experience of being around children with cancer. So it wasn't that they were coming from any experience that they'd had personally. They somehow in their head decided this wouldn't work, and they wanted to discourage anybody from trying it. So when you say, what would I fight for? I guess fight for the people who come with an idea that their gut tells them this is really going to be a winner. Put the blinders on and go for it, and don't listen to the negativity. So that anytime that I talk about the founding of Camp Quality, I try to make that point, that if you are listening to me and you've got an idea, listen to me now, put the blinders on and go for it, and don't let anybody discourage you from starting it.
That's wonderful advice, and really good to hear that and to be able to share that, because so many people, they've got great ideas, but they just get defeated because of that. Because it's not an easy thing to do, is it?
No, the problem right now is people look at Camp Quality and say, well, what a big success. But they have no idea what those first few years were like, and they will be like for anyone else that comes up with a good idea. It's rare that you come up with an idea that people then immediately say, oh, that sounds like a good idea. I can help with that.
Yes.
It wasn't that at all. It was being discouraged by people and then being let down by some who did think, well, I could help in this way, and would make a promise and then wouldn't follow through. So it was just, there was a lot of hurdles to overcome, and there will be for anyone else that comes up with a good idea that they think will benefit the community.
So we better give people a little bit of a rundown on what Camp Quality is in case they don't know.
Okay. It's a camping and support program for children with cancer. And the whole premise of our camping program centers around finding volunteers that we label companions. We don't use the word counselor because we're not there to counsel the kids. Those companions, we ask them to come and befriend a child and not only be with them on camp, but make a commitment to staying in touch with that child throughout the year. So it's not a flash in the pan, here's a bit of help, and then goodbye, see you next year. We wanted people to be able to really love and care for that child to such an extent that they wanted to stay in touch, whether that was just a phone call every week or an occasional trip out with the child or asking permission to take them out for the day or whatever. And the beauty of it, the thing that Brian used to tell me years later was, the companion idea, they're the cream of the crop. They're the ones that make the program run. And I really still believe that. They are the ones who I can turn to and say, thank you for everything you ever did for Camp Quality as a companion, because you're the reason we were a success.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I have known some of the companions, and they are beautiful, incredibly giving people who have really touched the lives of those children.
Mm-hmm. And far from being depressed, what they're always amazed at when they do finally go to camp is what a happy place it is.
Yes,
the children have no time for sadness. They don't want to dwell on negativity. And there's a spirit that children with cancer carry with them that I wish we could bottle it. I've always labeled them children of courage because they are. And it's interesting being on camp with a child who is not doing well on treatment. And usually we know before we go to camp which kids are not coping well. And then during the camp, they find out that some of the camper that they knew from the year before had died since. And they'd say to me, they had AML, didn't they? Acute myeloid leukemia. And I'd say, yeah, well, that's what I have. And I'd say, yeah, but I'm doing better. Their attitude was always turn it to the positive. They weren't very well, and I know, but I'm doing really well. Now, they may not be. But their attitude up here is, I am doing well, and I'm going to beat it. If adults with cancer could catch that same courageous spirit, it would be wonderful for them. But certainly for companions being around those kiddies, it's just a rare sight to see a child on a Camp Quality camp that's not happy. They've got big smiles on their face. They may be underweight. They may be pale. They may be thin. Doesn't make any difference. They're in the middle of camp. It's interesting that it's often on a camp that I pull aside a companion and say, just see if you can slow down your child a little bit. They're going to burn up all of the resources here on camp, on this. Well, we're trying, but they want to do everything. And I said, well, that's nice for them to want to do it all, but see if you can't get them to rest a little bit. But usually the children just throw themselves into the program. So they're easy to work with and easy to please.
Yes, and they do. They just have such a ball on those programs. It's just an amazing experience. So what is the backstory? Share with us how you started Camp Quality. Where'd the idea come from?
Well, I think one of the research projects that I did not long ago is that most people that found an organization come at it from their own need. And I certainly did. My dad took his own life, and I was left shattered. My dad was very quiet. If you can imagine Fred Astaire, my dad looked just like Fred Astaire, same build and same looks. but he was very quiet and very introverted. And in my mind, I don't think he ever recovered from World War II. You know, we talk about right now soldiers coming back, there's no emotional support for them here. Well, but the men that came back from World War II, there was nothing.
No.
There was never any counseling for my dad. And certainly after years of trying to cope with it, and he took his own life and left me a basket case. And like many people who have a suicide in the family, like it or not, you blame yourself. You know, and I would say to myself, if I'd been a better daughter, that wouldn't have happened. Dad wouldn't have done that. And you kind of almost self-destruct yourself in the middle of trying to cope. And in the middle of all of that, I was working as a director of sales for a company in Atlanta, Georgia, in America. And on one particular flight, I had been talking with the airline stewardess on my plane. And she said to me, "Will we see you on the Friday commuter flight coming back?" And I said, "No, you won't this week. I'm staying over. I'm going to a children's camp." And they said, "Oh, what do you do there?" And I said, "I'm the campfire leader. So I'll be on the camp doing the campfires for the week." And that was all it must have been a 3-minute conversation. Nearly now, we're 2 years ahead. And I'm on a plane knowing that this was going to be my last trip, because we had just been told by my husband's church that we were being assigned to Australia. And as I got on the plane, I saw this stewardess again, and she said, "I've been looking for you." And I said, "Oh, how come?" She said, "Do you remember us talking about you coming on the commuter flight and you said you were going to a camp?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, I read a magazine article and it just caught my heart, and I thought about you, and I tore it out of the magazine, and I've got it in my flight bag. I'll go get it." So she brought me this magazine article. On the cover of the article, there was a lovely picture of this little girl with dark curly hair. And the heading was, "What can we do for Teddy?" And as I read, I realized Teddy was a little girl that had been diagnosed with cancer on the same week that she'd had her 10th birthday party. And the whole article was first interviewing the father, then the mother, then the brother, and then the girl herself. And I was absolutely torn apart reading the story, because in a way, this little girl was dealing with her own coming death. She was very, very educated about what cancer was, and her parents had been very open with her in discussing it. And she knew that she wasn't going to live very long. And yet, despite all of that, her attitude was of care for her mother and dad and for her brother. And after I read the article, I sat there, I remember on that plane for hours thinking, here's a child of 12 trying to cope with her death. And here I'm an adult and I'm not doing well with it at all, just thinking about my dad. So after I got to my motel that night, I got a very patient long distance operator on the phone. And I said, "I want you to help me, if you will. I need very carefully to track down the family. All I can tell you is that the guy's name is Gary Mervis, and it's an unusual spelling. And if you can track that family, I really need to talk to them." So about half an hour, she went through all kinds of routine trying to find him. And she said, "You know, Vera, all you've told me is he lives in New York. Do you know how big that is?" She said, "Look, I've tried so many places, and the answer is no, they don't have anybody by that name." She said, "Let me just give it another try." So she did some more calls around, and then she came back online with me, and she said, "I can't find Gary Mervis, but I have found one family with that name." And I said, "Did they live in New York?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "Then put me through. I can ask them, do they know a Gary? Thank you for all your patience, but let's at least take that one call." So she put me on the call, and this man answered the phone, and I said, "I'm looking to find Gary Mervis. Do you have a Gary in your family?" And he laughed, and he said, "Lady, not only do I have a Gary, he's here for dinner at my house. Hold on, I'll put him on the phone." So this man came to the phone, and I said, "I'm so glad to find a Gary Mervis, but tell me first, are you Teddy's dad?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "Okay, you're the one I need to talk to." So I told him briefly what my need was, and I said, "I read your daughter's story, And she's so courageous and so articulate at your young age. I need you to tell me, what are you doing to help her? Is there anything at all that you can advise me that would help me? And he said, you know, you've called at the right time. The reason we're here tonight is we've all just come back from a camp. The whole family went. And I said, what kind of a camp? And he said, well, after being on the ward and seeing how sad the children are, I said to my wife, let's take Teddy and about 12 of the other kids from the ward and go on a campground together and at least let those kids play together and be kids again. So I said, so that's where you've been? And he said, yes. And I said, and what happened? And he stood there for the longest time and finally said, with tears in his voice, we heard her laugh again for the first time. And we have decided that whatever length of time we have with Teddy, and we've been told it's going to be very limited, we're going back to that setting as often as we can, because what we saw was children role modeling for other children how to cope. And it's a winner, so we're just going to keep going with that. And he said, look, Vera, I tell you what, get on a plane and come to the next camp. And I said, look, Gary, I would love to do that, but we are leaving for Australia. But I'll make a commitment to you after reading Teddy's story. When we get to Australia, I will look for a volunteer organization that helps kids with cancer like yours. And because of you and your daughter, I'll be a volunteer. Well, the short end of the story was then we arrived in Australia and immediately I began to research. Nothing. There wasn't anything anywhere like it. Finally got the courage up to go to one of the major children's cancer hospitals in Sydney. And I said to the nurses that I met on the ward there, which doctor should I talk to? I want to talk to a doctor about setting up a camp for children with cancer. And this man was pointed out to me and I went over to talk to him and I said to him briefly, I know you're busy, but I need some time with you if you can spare some time. I need to talk to you about an idea I have of running a camp for children with cancer. I'll never forget that doctor because he turned to me and he said, you're American, aren't you? And I said, no, actually, I'm British, but I just came from living in America. And he said, well, let me tell you, American kids might need the camps, but we don't need them here. Australian children don't have a need for those. So I hope you can find something else to do with your time. And he turned around and walked off. And I stood there stunned. And I remember getting in my car, and by this time I'm almost in tears.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, here's a man who 24 hours a day works with children with cancer. And he doesn't think it will work. And he doesn't think it's needed. Am I crazy? And I went home, and for 3 more days, I brooded about my own grief. And then one morning, Brian said to me, what are you going to do today, Vera? And mind you, I was in a house with no furniture, had nothing to dust, had nothing to clean. And I said, you know what, Brian, I got to thinking about that first doctor. And I realized he puts his pants on one leg at a time like you do. I'm not going to listen to him. I'm going to go try another hospital. And it's going to need 3 or 4 doctors like that to tell me we're not needed. I just would want to try it again. So I got in my car and I did what newcomers to Sydney tell me you never do. I drove through the city, got lost quite a few times, finding my way to the Prince of Wales Children's Hospital. Was walking down this long corridor towards where they told me that the children's cancer ward was, and this little man's walking towards me. And he was short and chubby, and he had glasses that were like the bottoms of bottles. They were so thick. And he smiled at me and he said, hey, are you here as a visitor? And I said, yes, I am. Are you a doctor? And he said, yes. And I said, I need to talk to a doctor that deals with cancer children. And he said, well, you're looking at him. He said, I'm the head of the cancer unit for children. And I said, and what's your name? Professor O'Gorman Hughes. And I said, well, Professor, have you got some time to talk to me? And he said, well, just give me a brief summary of what you want to talk about. And so I did. And he said, come with me. And we walked into his office. And he said to the secretary, I want you to get on the phone and I want you to call all of the major children's hospitals around the country and ask them all the same question. Do you have a camping and support program for kids with cancer? And if they do, get all the information to give to this lady. And he said to me, now sit down and wait here. I'll start my rounds and I'll come back and get you. So I sat there and I listened to this secretary. When he came back in, he said to the secretary, okay, what happened? And she said, interesting. Everyone that I talked to said, no, we don't have one, but if we find one, will I call them and let them know? And I smiled, and the prof said, why are you smiling? I said, well, evidently the first doctor I talked to in the other hospital didn't really know what he was talking about because he wasn't even interested and thought your children didn't need it. And prof said, oh, that's ridiculous. Anything that will help these children cope, anything you can do to give them something to look forward to, we will back you 100%. You come with me now. And I said, oh, where am I going? I'm going to take you into the ward. Now, as silly as it sounds, Andrew, if I could have turned and run at that moment, I would have. I've never been in a children's cancer ward. It was just a bit of a shock to the system. But I remember thinking, there's no way you can turn and walk out now. You've got to go with this man.
Yes.
He's saying we'll help you. So I went with him, and he marched me right up to the bed of this little boy. And he said to the boy, this lady's the visitor. You can chat with her. And he patted me on the back and he said, I'll finish my rounds and I'll catch you later. And he walked off, and I'm standing there at the bedside of this little kid. And he's as white as a sheet and as thin as he can be. And he's hooked up to an IV. And he looked up at me and he said, lady, do you have a kid on the ward? And I said, no. Or do you have cancer? And I said, no. What are you doing here? So I said, well, I came to talk about the idea of maybe setting up a camp for children with cancer. And he shot up in bed and he said, oh, what a great idea. When's it going to be? And I said, well, that's the problem. There isn't such a camp. And he said, yeah, but you're going to try to set one up? And I said, yeah. Well, how long do you think it'll take? And I said, well, I've only been in Australia 2 weeks, so I don't know how the charities are set up. I don't know where campgrounds are. I don't know where I'm going to find the money. I said, there's a lot of work that needs to go in, and it might be a year from now before we have one off the ground. And he said, well, I probably won't be alive then, but lady, you need to go for it. And talk about a lump in your throat.
Oh, yeah.
And I stood there looking down at this little boy, and he's still smiling at me. And I said, tell me, if there was such a camp, what would you want to do? If you came to that camp, what would you want to do? The thing that touched my heart then and still touches my heart is what they asked for were simple things. This little guy said, you know, my brother and I both, we used to be scouts. I can't go on a scout trip now because my scout leader is more afraid of needles than I am, and he's not there to give me any needles. So I stay home and I help my brother pack when he's going to camp. And I wait for him to come back. And as he's unpacking, he tells me everything that he's done on camp. So I said, so if there was a camp and you could come to it, and he said, then I would want to do things like, I'd like to ride a horse. Never ridden a horse, I'd like to ride a horse. I'd like to shoot a bow and arrow. And all in my mind, I'm thinking, that's easy, I can do that, I can do. And those were the kind of things that the children asked for. So after a little while of talking to him, I said to him, you know what? I'm going to walk around and ask some of the other children what they think. And so I moved on to the next bed, and there was a little girl in that bed, and I started to chat to her. And as I did, I heard what I thought were roller skates on the floor behind me, and I turned around to look, and it's the same little boy. He climbed down out of the bed and was wheeling his IV stand with him, and he patted me, and he said, lady, write this down. This is something else you need to do. And so he's giving me ideas, and the little girl's talking, and then they're sparking off each other with ideas. And for the rest of the morning, I moved from bed to bed, but I felt like the Pied Piper. I just collected children. They just joined the group, and we moved on to the next bed. And we finished up with about 8 or 9 children, all around one bed, all talking at once, all getting excited. And I'm getting worried, thinking, my gosh, how quick can we get this camp together? These kids need it today. And so as I was leaving, I said to the children, okay, your meal trays are coming. you better scramble back to bed, and I'll be back in sometime soon and talk to you again. And as I was walking out, the little boy shouted me back, and he said, wait a minute, before you go, I just have one more question for you. And I said, what? He said, well, now that you know we're all excited about it, when do you really think the camp can be? And I said, I did tell you I've got a lot of work to do. I'm new to the country. I said, I don't know your charity laws. I'll have to study all of that. And I went on with a whole list of things. And he said, yeah, I know it's going to be a lot of work, but at the best, what do you think? And I said, well, at the best, I would think at least 9 months. And he said, well, you know what I told you, lady, you need to go for it. And I walked out of that ward so determined that despite all the doomsayers that it wasn't going to work, with children with the attitude that those children had, it was going to work. And it would take the children maybe to teach the adults that we want to do this and this is going to work for us. Mm-hmm. Well, we went to camp. That was January, and it was actually February of 1983. And in September, we were on camp.
Yes.
And it was the biggest success. Kids that had never been on any kind of camp like that, dealing with a bunch of adults who'd never run a camp like that. But the children were so willing and so eager to make it work that they made it work. Their attitude was wonderful. And the people that had volunteered to come as companions were blown away by the attitude of the children. So it took almost proving to people that it would, proving to adults that it would work for it to work properly. And we never really looked back after that first year. But getting to it, Andrea, I wouldn't want to go through those months again, because when we finished camp, I was $389 in the red because we hadn't raised enough money. And on camp itself, Brian had said to me, well, you're already in the red, Vera. How are you going to keep going? And I said, I don't know, but you know what? The next time I give a speech to Rotary or Lions or whatever, it's from me saying, don't tell me this won't work. I know it will. We've made it work and it was successful. So just tell me how you're going to help. And I did that a lot, talking to Rotary and Lions and so on. And bless their heart, they came on board really quickly. Rotarians in particular were just brilliant at fundraising for us.
Yes.
But it was because of hearing true stories, not fiction. Stories of children on camp and their behavior and the lessons that they taught me along the way. It was a steep learning curve for me, but it was children teaching me how to cope and how to deal with some of the issues that they have to deal with. And they're brave. They're so brave.
It's such a beautiful story, and really, if I get to the basics of it, it just shows that when you've got your own issues, the best thing you can do is to help somebody else.
Well, I always said after that year, the children healed my grief one Band-Aid at a time.
Yes.
Just watching them and listening to them and being amazed at times how well they coped.
Yeah.
The very first year, there was a television crew that was sent out to camp to do some filming. And I can still see them standing at the end of the dining hall with the camera going, and it was lunchtime. And one of the children that we had on camp was a wonderful little boy called Michael, who had leukemia, but was also Down syndrome. And his mom had been a little reluctant to send him, not because of the camp itself, but because of Michael not listening to instructions and maybe giving us a problem. And I said to her, look, we will take care of it. He'll have a one-on-one companion, and that companion will never leave his side. And the rest of us will give whatever backup we need to. We want him there, and I think he'll do well. Well, he was a joy on camp. But what was funny was the morning that we arrived on camp, and I said to the children, okay, I want you to gather around now, because there's a few rules that we have here. We don't have many, but we have a few. And I want you to understand the few that we have. And so the children all gathered, and Michael came pushing through the crowd and right up next to me, and he's looking up at me. And he said, okay, I listened to the rules. And I said, okay, that's what your mommy said. Yeah, she did. Okay. So I said, well, rules are, this is probably the only camp there is where if you don't like what we feed for lunch, you can go and raid the kitchen. Because we want you all to eat. We don't want you to ever go hungry. And you must not go hungry. If you're hungry, you come and tell me or one of the staff, and we'll go back in the kitchen with you and we'll scrounge something that you will eat. And he said, okay. So by this time, the children are all lining up to go into the meal. And he went straight to the front of the line. And children, bless their heart, took one look at him and decided, we're not arguing with him. It's okay for him to jump the line. So he got his meal, took it to this table, sat down and ate it quickly, and then put both hands behind his back and started to march up and down the dining room. And I said, Michael, what are you doing? He said, I'm just watching for someone that does not behave. And I said, oh, okay. So off you go. So he went walking off, and pretty soon he came back to me, come with me. And I said, where are we going? He said, you are going to talk to Christian. And I said, why? What's he done? Well, he threw some bread. He said, no, you told us don't play with the food. And I said, well, that's true. He said, what's his punishment? I said, well, we're going to have him stand on a chair and sing a song. And he said, okay. So we went to Christian, and this little boy, again, took one look at Michael and one look at me, and I'm winking at him so Michael can't see. I said, Michael tells me you're throwing some bread, so your punishment is to stand on a chair and sing a song. And so he says, okay, and he gets up to get on the chair, and Michael shouted, no. I said, no, what's wrong? He sings terribly, he said. And I knew they came from two different hospitals. I thought he doesn't know whether he can sing or not. And I said, so what? And he said, well, so I sing for him. And I said, oh, okay. Up on the chair you go. So he climbs on the chair because the television cameras are going in the background. And I said, what are you going to sing, Michael? He said, first you blow the whistle and tell everyone be quiet and listen. So I did that. And he belted out this song, What About Me? It isn't fair. I've had enough and I want my share. Can't you see that you take more than you give? And there wasn't a dry eye in the place. No. I looked on the cameraman or crying. You know, I thought about that song so often afterwards. It's true for kids like him.
Yeah.
It must seem like we take everything and we don't give much back. And for that little boy, just being on the camp was joy enough. And he spent all camp, when he wasn't in the middle of an activity, he'd look around and see some staff member and he'd shout, Vera. And I'd say, what? I love you. And I'd say, I love you too. All right. So there were enough experiences like that with the Michaels of the world and with children that just were not well at all and really were in the ravages of cancer treatment, and yet still smiling and still willing to try anything they hadn't tried before. So bless their hearts. They were the reasons that Camp Quality was a success, because they threw themselves into the program.
Yes, it's beautiful. Now, we're running out of time, but I had a couple of other questions that I quickly wanted to ask you.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about community. Now, there was always a lot of volunteers and you rely on them, but I want to know what it meant to the volunteers, to the people who were getting involved in making Camp Quality happen.
It's interesting to think about that issue, because in my mind anyway, Andrew, once we got the first year off the ground, it seemed to me like the whole of Australia opens its arms to Camp Quality.
Mm.
People were quick then to jump on the bandwagon when they realized this is not going to be a fluke, it is going to go. And they wanted to be involved in some way. The interesting thing about the companion issue is not only were they willing to come and give a week of their holiday to be on camp with children, they did follow-ups with their campers, and I'd get feedback from parents all the time, to the point where parents would often say, we love our companion, like it was a companion for the family. And that always touched me deeply. But it was companions too who would come to me and say, do you need someone else to go out and give a talk to Rotary? And I'd say, yeah, are you willing? And they'd say, yeah. And I said, then that's great, I'll sign you up. Yeah, so we had them offering to do other things and offering to families to do other things, to go and babysit, because usually the children had at least one brother and sister at home still. So they would go and they would babysit for the mother and dad. So the mother and dad got a night out. There were all kinds of additional things that came from those companions, not only loving the child on camp that was their camper, but also realizing firsthand the stress on the families. So it was kind of like educating a whole community. So the camps began with 38 children on the very first camp. But by the end of a few years, we had 100 kids with cancer on every camp and 100 companions. Yeah. And about 25 auxiliary staff running the programs and so on. So it was quite a community when it got together. And then finding ways to raise money is not easy. Even for charities, it isn't easy. And I was fortunate that Vic Alberts, who was the man that owned the hot air balloon that we had as our first Camp Quality symbol with the Australian flag on, when he realized what I was doing, he said to me, "What are you doing next Thursday?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you can come and speak to my club." And I said, "Well, you better ask, who's they've got on the speaker." He said, no, don't worry about that. We'll bump off whoever it is. We'll get you in there quick. You need the money. And I said, yeah, I did. So I went to Rotary of Balmain. I left that club with about 10 individual checks for 10 campers they wanted to fund. And then the club gave me a donation of about $5,000. But the thing that helped is those Rotarians went home and called other clubs. And suddenly, 4 or 5 nights a week, I was invited to give speeches to Rotary clubs, and every club, without question, got involved and helped. And it really got us off the ground. It got us to the first camp for sure. I wouldn't have been able to do that without the Rotary money. But it just kept spreading, and they would share with other people, and we'd get invites to go and get a grant from here or money from there. So the Rotarians have a lot for me to be thankful for, because they did get it off the ground.
They did. And I do know secondhand through my mother, who worked with Camp Quality, that she was always there too, when they provided a lot of support for her in Victoria.
She was a brilliant camp director for Melbourne.
Yes. And one more quick question. Camp Quality has been going for almost 40 years.
40 years next year is our anniversary.
Now, you're retired from Camp Quality. Is there life after Camp Quality for Vera?
Yes. Yeah, there really is. It didn't seem like it at first. I mean, it was a big step down for me to walk away from the program. And sadly for me, the guy that took over for me didn't want me around. He would rather I didn't exist. And so I felt cut off completely. And so the only way I could deal with that was find another project. And what Brian and I did was go to Shanghai, China, and teach school for 3 years. We taught English and loved it. And I remember saying to Brian after the first year or so in Shanghai, there is life after Camp Quality, and I enjoy it, but part of it was I was still with children, and I really loved that. And so we did 3 years in Shanghai, came back to Australia, and within a couple of months were bored again. I went to Taiwan and served there for 2 years. So yes, there is life after, but when you lose a program or a partner or whatever, it's the memories that you hold on to. And I still have such wonderful memories of my times on camps with those children. Every year I spent at least 1 week on a camp, and sometimes the other camp directors in other areas would invite me into their camp for a week. I took those chances, any chance I got, because I knew that there'd be something that would trigger me to think of something else, some issue that maybe we could deal with. Like, for instance, our Camp Quality puppets. That came about because of being on camp with children who, in that relaxed atmosphere of camp, started to talk about, this is what happens to me when I go back to school. And some of it was horror stories. And I remember leaving a camp after a week of listening to those stories, feeling really heartbroken for the children that they had that to deal with. And that night there was a making of the Muppets on television. And on the set with the Muppets were children, real children. And it was the faces of those children watching the puppets that grabbed my attention. And next day I went back to the office and I said, well, you know what we need? We need a set of puppets. Now, where can I find the money? And where can we find a puppet maker? And so the research began. And in the middle of that, Paul Newman, bless his heart, had heard about our program, sent me a letter saying, it sounds like you've got the camps off the ground. Do you have needs for more money for a new project? What have you got in mind? And I wrote and told him that I would love to have this set of puppets that we could send into the schools to teach children to be loving and caring of kids that come back to school after any major illness. Back came a $75,000 check from Paul Newman, and we scrambled and we got a set of puppets made, and we started them into schools, and it's been a huge success. So yeah, there's always the thing being around children is if you listen carefully, they'll trigger another idea in you. And most of the ideas that were successes came from children.
Beautiful. I really want to thank you for being on the podcast today, Vera. It's been wonderful to listen to the stories and to hear the journey that you've been on to. And I'm sure people will listen to it, and if they've got an idea, you've given them lots of advice, but also that stick to it and really work with it, because it's worthwhile. If you've been given an idea, you've got to work for it. Got to go for it.
Well, when people ask me, Andrea, who benefits the most from Camp Quality, they get the same answer. You're looking at her. Yeah. It's me. I know that. You know, they healed my grief one Band-Aid at a time, and bless their hearts, they continue to touch the lives of anyone who works on camp. Yes.
And it's a beautiful legacy that you have created, and I'm privileged to know the story, to feel connected to it.
That's great.
So thank you so much, Vera.
Thanks for the invitation.
And that's all we have time for today on the Social Mission Revolution. I'll be back next time with another Social Mission Revolutionist. Discover how you can become a social mission revolutionist in your business by reading Andrea's latest book, Compassionate Prosperity When Success Is Not Enough. Grab your copy now at www.socialmissionrevolution.com or from your favourite online bookseller.